Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the what month are we in? June Cafe Scientifique. Thank you all for braving the brilliantly warm and pleasant weather outside. We're very glad to see you again. You've all read the blurb and the synopsis of tonight's event, so I won't read it out to you again. Short to say, would you please bring your hands together and welcome our speaker, Alec Tang.
Thanks, Scott. I just realised that I had some handouts and they're over here in my bag. So apologies, I'm going to be the roving mic. I love microphones, they make me feel important. Kia ora everybody, so Alec Tang here. You can all hear me fine, good? Too well. Is this better, or can you hear me at the back? No. Oh, okay, right. That's okay. I'll do that, I'll do this. Those of you who haven't read the blurb, so I am currently the Director of Sustainability at Kai Water. So those of you hopefully know Kai Water, if you want to just share it out. That's the government kind of collaborative, the bringing together of Kiwi Build, Housing New Zealand, and HLC, Holland the Land Company as it was. Very much about building houses, urban development, all those kind of things. I'm not talking as Kai Water tonight. Prior to being at Kai Water, I was the Chief Sustainability Officer at Auckland Council. So basically ran the team there, worked on the regional climate plan, so Te Tātakia Tāwhiri, Auckland's climate plan, and obviously thought a lot about urban development, growth, what does this mean for our cities, and some of the challenges that we face. I'm also not going to be talking here on behalf of Auckland Council either, but what I wanted to do, and talking to Scott, we thought it might be useful to throw around some stuff about cities, yeah? So we're all in cities, most people here live in Auckland, no one's travelled too far to come for tonight. So I wanted to throw some stuff up. We've got about 20 minutes or so, I've got a few bits of information I just want to throw out there, and then we'll have a bit of a drinks break and open to questions, thoughts, ideas. The big reason why, and just a bit of background, I guess I've spent most of my career actually working in corporate sustainability, so helping companies, businesses think about, how do we manage sustainability, climate change, environmental issues. And I only actually came into Auckland Council, started thinking about cities about 6 odd years ago. So relatively new into that space, relatively new into local central government. But at that time, generally speaking, there was a real push or big recognition that cities are one of the biggest opportunities that we have from a sustainability perspective, but also one of the places where we're potentially going to have some of the biggest sustainability impacts. And so that's kind of where I come from, very much from a corporate background, but actually starting to think about cities. There are others in the room who have probably thought about this a lot more, and this is kind of tonight, I really want to throw some of this stuff around. This, I'm going to say slide because it's sliding. This is probably, this is Auckland-centric. These are some of the big things that we need to think about going forward. And one of those big things is growth, right? So we're currently 1.72 million. I always thought it was 1.6. We're 1.72 as of March this year. The projections are, Stats New Zealand are saying that we are going to hit about 2 million people by 2033. And the Auckland Plan says it will be about 2.4 million people by 2050. And that was projections that were done before COVID happened. So you can imagine when we navigate through the current phase of COVID, that projection may well increase quite significantly. Yeah, in terms of how many people want to live in New Zealand and are really keen to come to Auckland. So we're talking about 600,000 odd more people in Auckland in the next 30 years. And what that means from a resource perspective is about 300,000 more dwellings, more houses, more homes that we need to fit within the Auckland region. Currently, we have about 560,000 dwellings. So if you think we need an extra 300,000, that's basically another half as many houses as we already have in the region. We're currently operating on about a 75,000 shortfall in housing. So the number of people in our city, we're short by that 75,000. I know from Kai Water's perspective, we are looking to build 40,000. So that just gives you the scale of house building that we're going to need above and beyond what's planned and above and beyond the deficit that we currently have. Huge amount of houses that need to be built, but if we think beyond the houses themselves, there's about, the Auckland Plan says we need to find 260,000 jobs for these people coming in. Jobs for people to do, work, income, all that kind of stuff. And then beyond that, we have things like food, we have water, we have other resources that extra 600,000 people are going to need. We think about transport, I'm sure we'll talk about transport today. How do we move those people around? How do we get people to the places they want to go, to the connectivity they want to see? How do we build communities? So those facilities, those community facilities and services that we often take for granted, our libraries, our pools, the community events, to service that extra 600,000 odd people is going to be big. So one of our big challenges, which is actually not a bad challenge to have. Other places around the world, we're not seeing growth, and they have a very different challenge that they've got to face and that they've got to deal with. So we've got this growth pressure. Is that going to stick? Just maybe. Oh, no, let me see actually how it works a little bit. I'm going to leave these up because I think it's really important to think about these issues as we kind of go forward. So we've got the growth stuff, and you'll see the slides I've handed out. So that's growth, right? A lot of growth that we're going to see. The other thing that we're going to have to deal with is climate change. So this is the work that we were doing at Auckland Council. The climate plan that's online, it's available if you want to click on the link. And within the plan, there's a commitment from Council that's been made on two levels. One is about reducing our emissions. And fundamentally what we've said here is we need to halve our greenhouse gas emissions in the next 10 years, so by 2030, less than 10 years, 9 years. And we need to reach net zero emissions by 2050. What that means is this is our current emissions profile. I don't know if anyone, has anyone seen this? So this is really interesting. So where do our emissions come from? 43.5%, 43.6% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from transport. Yeah. So massive input here. Cars and light commercial vehicles are about 30%. We've got buses that are 0.8, heavy vehicles 6.8, trains, ferries and ships. So that is by far and away the biggest component of our emissions profile. We then have our buildings or our stationary energy, so buildings, and then manufacturing and construction. And then we have a whole bunch of industrial uses, so glass making, steel production, 15%. Small facility down in Glenbrook is 15% of our regional emissions. But it's a really important question here, right? So we could knock off 15% of our emissions if Glenbrook closed, but we're still using steel. Yeah, so those emissions are still being generated somewhere, and you'd argue if they're being generated here versus somewhere, steel production in China or whatnot, does that mean it's better or worse? So some really interesting stuff there around 15% of our emissions being steel focused. So this is the profile that we currently sit at, and this was the modelling that we did to say, well, we've set these targets, halving those greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, net zero by 2050. And we basically identified that transport emissions is going to wear the brunt of our reduction. Because we know that different sectors are at different stages. Agriculture, we have agriculture, we're lucky it's only 6% of our regional emissions, so we don't need to have that much of a debate about agriculture emissions as other parts of New Zealand. But we still need our agricultural emissions to reduce. But transport's where the opportunity lies in terms of, yes, moving to electric vehicles, but actually thinking very differently about how we move around the city. We did some modelling, we did some work to say, well, that's all well and good. What does this mean in reality? And if you can't read that, there's the slides going around. Whole bunch of areas that we need to see emissions reduction. So that first one talks about transport, and fundamentally that big, we want to see we need to see 64% reductions in transport emissions if we're going to see this trajectory coming through. What does this actually mean? So sometimes we talk about targets. What this means in reality is if we don't see 64% reduction in transport emissions, we're going to need to see more somewhere else if we're going to hit those targets. This was seen as the most practical, pragmatic. We will potentially be able to do that. What does 64% reduction in transport emissions mean? It means significant change in how we move around the city. So public transport, currently about 7.8% of our trips by distance are done by public transport. We need that to increase to 24%. So what's that? 3 and a bit times increase in public transport patronage. We need cycling to move from less than 1% to 7%. We need more walking from 4 to 6%. This is by 2030, so this is in the next 9 years. We need to see that transformation in how we move around. Yes, there's an electrification component, so 40% of our light passenger commercial vehicles need to be electric. But the biggest thing we need to look at is where we're building where we're housing those 600,000 extra people and where we move people around. So for us to achieve the 64% reduction, 40% of these new dwellings, the new buildings, the new homes that we're building need to be in what's called transit oriented. So, near rapid transit, near public transport, near places where people then don't have to drive around so much. So that's what we need to see in the next 9 years to get that 64% reduction. What we also need, so this is all and. We need to see this 65% reduction. This term stationary energy is kind of techie. It's very much like energy consumption in buildings, so electricity used to power this building, heat, cooling, all that kind of stuff, natural gas use, all that kind of stuff. And what we said is to get this 65%, and these are just a snapshot of the kinds of things we need to see, right? So you obviously have to do more than just this. So 20% of buildings need to have solar photovoltaics. 50% of existing buildings need to be retrofitted. So one of our big challenges is our existing houses are really leaky, really drafty, very inefficient. So that means they need more power to heat them to a healthy standard. So we need to retrofit half of our buildings to better efficiency. And then all our new buildings, every building that we build, need to operate at net zero emissions, so effectively not be consuming greenhouse gases or being offset that greenhouse gas component as they are operating into the future. So this is our buildings. Our waste also needs to be addressed. We currently, our trajectory for waste is just continuous to increase. We're generating more and more waste every single day. So we need to see that 24% reduction in emissions, which actually means that our waste generation needs to plateau, right? And basically we need to make sure that food waste is reduced, paper plastic waste is reduced, wood waste is reduced. And we've kind of identified this 30% reduction in waste generated with an additional 30% diverted to other non-landfill uses, whether it's digestion, composting, recycling, or producing energy. So our waste needs to be dealt with. And then, as I said, agricultural emissions also need to be addressed, both in terms of methane from livestock, planting new forests. So this is important, but it also is only one part. So we often think about, when we talk about, how do we address this, we plant a lot more trees. We would need a hell of a lot of land to plant the amount of trees that we need. And so a lot of what we talk about is about transforming the way that we live in our cities, the way that we build our cities, the way we move around our cities, the way that we think about waste and consumption in our cities. And then we can probably plant some trees to offset the residual emissions. And then things like fertilizer use. So we don't often think, when we think about agriculture, we think about cows, we think about sheep and whatnot. There's a huge amount of emissions in our fertilizer use as well. So there's a big change that we need to see both in our urban form, how we move around, and agricultural emissions as we think about this growth that we have over here. Right? So this is the change we need to see in how we do things whilst we're growing as a city. So big challenges that we're facing as Auckland, as other cities as well. And this is the important thing, that we're not unique in terms of, thank you very much. We're not unique in those challenges. Auckland is it's a member of this network called C40, which is a whole bunch of 90 global megacities, all committed to reducing emissions and preparing for the impacts of climate change. And so that's the second bit, right? We have that emissions reduction side of things, given the growth that we're going to see. But we also know that climate change is happening. Even if we did all this, this is all to attempt to keep within 1.5 degrees of warming. We're at about 1.1, just coming up to 1.2 degrees of warming already. The likelihood is we're going to go beyond 1.5. And so we need to prepare for the impacts of climate change. Our current trajectory is about 3.5 degrees a year. And when we talk about preparing for the impacts of climate change, we often just focus on this bit, where we talk about risks resulting from the physical impacts of climate change. So whether that's acute, so droughts, floods, fires, those one-off events, those big extremes that we see, but we also think about those long-term shifts, so generally increasing temperature, increasing precipitation, all that kind of stuff. So we often focus here on those risks. And if I'm honest, they're relatively easy to adapt to. You know, you build differently, you don't build in those floodplains. You might consider actually some physical interventions, stormwater interventions where you actually do daylight streams, all that kind of stuff. This is doable if you actually invest in it. The bit that we often don't think about is the risks of transition. So knowing that we have to do this over here, knowing that we have to change the way that we move around, how do we make sure that that transition is equitable, is fair, how we respond to policy changes, how we develop those policy changes, the technology change. So one of those classic ones is the electric vehicle shift that we see over here. You know, if we don't move quickly enough as New Zealand, then we have a huge market penalty that we're facing because the supply chains will orientate towards those left-hand drive. Remember, we're left-hand drive, so one of the few countries that left-hand drive. And we're competing against places like the UK and some very large consumers of vehicles. And if we don't move, then we're going to be left with a whole bunch of stranded assets, fossil fuel vehicles that will become increasingly expensive to run, increasingly difficult to maintain as that transition happens. So there's a huge amount of impacts of climate change that we need to deal with in terms of that transition that we can either proactively try and move towards, or the global market will force us towards it. And if we wait, then it's going to be increasingly difficult and we're going to be really vulnerable to those changes. And so what this means, and the other thing about the impacts of climate change is there's a huge amount of uncertainty. We don't know. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty in how far, how big a response we're going to make, how big a response we're going to see globally, what the changes are. So there's lots of uncertainty in how much sea level might rise, flooding might happen, technology might change. And so there's this thing called dynamic adaptive policy pathways that's emerging. In terms of how do we respond to this uncertainty, what we need is a whole bunch of different pathways, a whole bunch of different interventions that we might see. So often one of the examples that's used is like in terms of coastal inundation, we have different interventions. We could build a seawall. We could stay where we are, we could build a seawall, we could build a bund or something, we could build on stilts, we can move away, we can retreat from the area. And so what we need to do is we need to understand all those different scenarios. Think about the triggers. Think about when we might make the decision. Right now, we're okay, we're not going to do anything, but at some point when the sea level rise gets to a certain point, we might actually think we need to change tack and we actually do need to move. Or we might see that the interventions that we've seen globally mean that sea level rise isn't going to be as big as we thought it was going to be, so actually that seawall may be okay as an intervention. But it's important to think about a whole range of options, a whole range of different pathways, and to have those trigger points so we can move between them. So this flexibility, this adaptability, is something that we're going to start needing to build into our cities. So historically, we've seen our cities and we just imprint it, and we say, this is the form, this is the infrastructure, that's going to do us for the next 50, 100 plus years. With climate change particularly, but also the uncertainties of drought and whatnot, we just can't do that anymore. And we need to make sure that there's some degree of flexibility in terms of how we're planning our cities. Thank you. So the question is, well, how do we reshape those cities? What do we do? How do we plan? Some of you may have seen the Auckland Plan. Who's seen the Auckland Plan? Who's heard of the Auckland Plan? Yes, of course, Julie. Great. Fantastic. So those of you who don't know the Auckland Plan, if you go to aucklandplan.co.nz, I think, or you just Google it, you'll see basically it's the 30-year vision for the city. for the region. And for my sins, I was involved in some of this. And it kind of built in the flexibility, the adaptability, the challenges that we face. And what we talked about in the Auckland Plan is, as a city, we don't know exactly what the future is going to hold. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like. But what we can say is there are a number of outcomes that make a city successful, or a number of components of things like homes and places. So do we have homes? It's important here, homes not just housing. So we're not just talking about building houses, but there are kinds of homes and places. So those bits around the houses that make them homes, you know, parks and facilities and all that kind of stuff that make it place, commercial parts, the corner shop, all that kind of stuff is really important for a city. Opportunity and prosperity, so in some way people contribute to their local economy. You know, it could be a formal job, but actually there's a lot of non-job related functions that we need people to do. So do we have the opportunity to prosper? Do we have the opportunity to contribute to our local economy? This big one around the environment, obviously the bit that I was interested in, but that went to heritage as well. And the way that we manage those two, that we don't just put a fence around it and say, look, there's your bit of the natural environment, go look at it over there. We need to bring it into our cities. We need to understand the heritage that has shaped our cities. Because fundamentally, if we don't do that, then we can't do this bit, which is build a sense of belonging and a sense of participation in our city. And this social element is probably one of the biggest challenges that we face as we intensify, as we grow bigger, as we try and build those houses in a more compact form. How do we ensure that people actually still feel a part of this city? How do we know or how do we make it a place that they're participating in the governance in that city? Because it's really important to have that engagement with people, otherwise they get really dissociated with that city that they're in. Obviously, being where we are, that Māori identity, that well-being is a key part of that heritage that we need to throw around. And then the final one is around transport and access. So with all this in mind, knowing that we're needing a pretty radical change in how we move around that city, how do we enable that? And I don't know, George, if you were there at the time, but we didn't actually want to call this transport and access. We wanted to call this access and connectivity, to just drop the transport side, so that we could actually really generally go, actually it's not about transport itself, it's how we connect people. And it could be, transport is potentially one of the ways it can do that. Digital technology, bringing people closer, it's about access to the things that people wish to access and connect. So so we approach it from an outcomes base, right? So shaping our cities based on the outcomes we want to seek, not just the physical, like, how do we connect pipes and how do we connect roads? How do we reshape those cities based on these outcomes we want to see? The other one I want to throw, and I'm just throwing a whole bunch of stuff so we can talk about this later. This is a concept called the Thriving Cities Framework, which C40, that group that I mentioned, Kate Rayworth from, those of you know about donor economics, her institute kind of worked with C40 circular economies to say, well, as a city, what we need to think about to thrive is a number of contexts. We need to think about a local context and a global context. We need to think about social foundation. Who's seen that donor economics proposal? So those of you who don't, the foundation is we have a number of planetary boundaries, so ecological limits that we need to operate within, but we also have a social floor. So there's a minimum that we need for society to thrive around food, around housing, around health, all those kinds of outcomes. But we need to live within this kind of planetary boundaries of obviously climate, nitrogen cycles, all that kind of stuff. And so this evolved from that, and it basically said, you know, what would we need for people to thrive socially? What would it mean for the city to respect the well-being of people worldwide? So there's a local and a global context. And from an ecological and environmental phase, what does it mean for the city to thrive within its context, within its current natural habitat? So thinking about the natural environment that the city works within, versus what will it mean for the city to respect the health of the whole planet? So we think about things like ozone depleting substances. We have a role to play in those different factors. The emissions that we generate here actually impact climate change globally. So increasingly we're seeing people go, well, actually it's not just about the spatial form, it's about some of these outcomes we want to see and some of the bigger picture components we need to operate in. Yeah. So I'll leave that because that's, you know, something that would be great to throw around in terms of those outcomes, in terms of what we're seeking, what we want to see. So my last little bit before hopefully we break off for a little bit of a chat and or field some questions straight away if people want to. I just wanted to throw this up here as some of the challenges. So we have all this. This is like, for me, conceptual challenges, both for growth, climate change, how we do reshape those cities. I throw this up here as a continual change, and I want to do this. I forgot my pen. The top one really talks about the scale of change that I'm talking about. We're talking about that we need to see. It's pretty big, right? There's a lot of change that we need to see, but it's really important to think about the change that we've already seen. So this is a bit of a timeline. We're here in 2020, 2021. We're looking out 30 years to 2050. But if we look back to 1990, there's a whole bunch of change that we've seen in the past 30 years. This is one of the first mobile telephones. Not mobile, the Motorola Microtech. Does anyone know when that was created?
84.
Close. You've seen my images before, so you can't take part of it.
Yeah, good call.
This was 1989. This is what a phone looked like 32 years ago. Massive brick. Does anyone know when the World Wide Web was launched?
72.
World Wide Web, not the internet, the World Wide Web. 30 years ago, we didn't have the internet. We did not have the internet just over 30 years ago. We did not have the internet. DVDs. Does anyone know when the first DVD came out? First DVDs came out 1995. Our iPods came out 2001. Twitter was 2006. iPhone 1 was 2007. The Tesla Roadster. So we have this conversation about electric vehicles. The Tesla Roadster. Sorry, I have to look at my notes because it's really hard for me. That was 2008. So that's what, 15 years ago. Tesla was building cars. Sorry, 13 years. We're building electric cars there. And then we have this massive thing here where we have car share, Uber. We all know Uber. Uber was a fairly recent thing, if you think about it. 2016, I want to say. Lime, so that perennial scooter stuff, was only 2017-ish. All the stuff that we're thinking, actually, you know, it's been around. This was all relatively recent, and these have really transformed the way that we look at the world. Right? And this is the latest iPhone 12, which is just about 2001. So that evolution from this thing here that you could barely talk to someone on, and I don't know if you've seen them, they have like a massive battery pack as well. So you're not only lugging this thing, you're lugging a big battery. So this thing here, which is this thing here, which has got more computing capacity than a lot of the computers were back here. That's the kind of transformation we've seen in the last 30 years. First human beings landing on the planet, on Mars, they were planning, this was pre-COVID, they were planning on 2030 that we'd get onto Mars. And so we're thinking, yeah, there's a massive amount of change we need to do. We need to think very differently about our cities, the form they take, how we enable these other outcomes whilst we grow quite substantially, how we address climate change in terms of the way we move around, the way we build. And we've got 9 years to do it, but we look back at the 9 years that we've had previously, the technology, the evolution that we've seen. This is a long time. Well, it's not a long time, but it is a long time in terms of evolution and stuff. And then to get to 2050, where we need to see net zero, that's pretty massive. Oh, self-driving taxi service. That's already happening. There's businesses, there's models over in America that is already doing. That's not a future thing. So we have this context. The scale of change is massive that we need to see, but we need to not forget the amount of change that we've seen in the last 30 years, 10 years, 15 years. So there's an opportunity here. There's a real opportunity. And I'd love to explore this, the reality of the change that we see. This is people. We have a whole continuum of people, right? And in that continuum, there'll be lots of people going, why haven't we done this already? You know, we should have done this 10 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever. There's a whole bunch of people going, not here, not now, not ever. I don't want to see this.
And so we have both ends of this spectrum, right? And we often hear just from these two ends of the spectrum. There is a lot of people in the middle going, I don't know, I'm keen to know more though. I'm open to thinking about this. And our current systems really don't allow for this. Particularly social media just amplifies these two on either end. And having worked in council, you know, our politicians are thrown this a lot. Our systems don't enable this at all. And so how we build our cities, face these challenges in a way that we can do it and bring these people along in the middle is one of the biggest challenges that I think we face as a society, as a city, as people. Because if we don't manage to do this, then we end up with this really divisive fight on either side, which doesn't help anyone. It actually means that we stay still. We just don't move anywhere, which we can't, which won't work. You know, these things are happening. This change is happening. So we can either proactively go, or we stay and things happen to us, which ultimately is a big fail. So yeah, so I just wanted to throw that out, just kind of reflections of, you know, my time at council in Kainora. And yeah, that was kind of it, just to throw out, you know, a whole bunch of challenges, bunch of opportunity, some reality that sits here as well. And I think I'm happy to take any questions on any of this now, otherwise we grab a drink or something and come back.
Yeah, so first of all, can we have a round of applause for our speaker? Trust me, thanks again from everyone here at the Auckland Museum Institute for viewing our Café Scientifique. We hope you've enjoyed the talk tonight. If you did, don't forget to hit the like button down below and subscribe so you can catch more of our videos later.